So to conclude this stocktaking lecture and the course, I want to return to this four-part structure that we use to analyze reactions to industrialization in the 19th century. And I want to apply that to some of the technologies and some of the developments that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. To do this, I want to go back again and think about the values that we looked at that were used to criticize the industrialization, particularly of Britain in the early 19th century. These four things: is it good, is it true, is it right, and or is it beautiful? So morality, on the question of authenticity, the question of ethics, and the question of aesthetics. You may remember that we looked at these four or five thinkers in particular. Ruskin, who was a moralist, was worried about the kind of effects of industrialization on our souls, for lack of a better term. The ideas expressed by Horatio Greenough, Viollet-le-Duc, and others who thought about whether industrially produced products could be authentic or kind of honest, an ontological approach. William Morris, who was more concerned with the effects of industrialization on workers, an ethical approach. And then finally, Emerson, Louis Sullivan, Thoreau, and others who saw potential but also were concerned about the sensory experiences, what the industrialization did to our sense of beauty and aesthetic response. I would argue that these are still valid today, and they frame a lot of the discussion and a lot of the debate we have about the impact of technology and what we try to do with it today. Do we have a kind of arts and crafts response to all of the new things that have come online in the last 15 or 20 years? These aren't always kind of anti-technological. I want to look at one example or one way of thinking in particular that actually sees real meaning in thinking about what these technologies can kind of reveal. They're not all necessarily anti-capital either. I think they are in some ways critical, right? Looking at the conversion of so much of the kind of architectural world or the built world into commodities, but not necessarily against the idea that these are involved in making better, more profitable products out of what we do. Some of these movements actually do seek greater value, but have a slightly broader horizon, thinking about value not in terms of the immediate amortization or the immediate profitability of a project, but the long-term, literally the sustainable profit over time of these things. One figure that I want to put forward as someone who really encapsulated a lot of this concern is the historian and critic Kenneth Frampton. In this call for, as he put it, a return to the tectonic, or an interest in thinking about construction as a language, as a place where value can reside, both in experience and in meaning. In 1990, he said that one of the reasons he was interested in sort of returning, as he put it, to this idea that construction was meaningful was that there was so much, even at this point, even 30 years ago, that had turned architecture into scenography, right, or turned it into just pure imagery. Some of this, he said, was intentional. He pointed to Robert Venturi in particular as someone who had really promoted the idea of this kind of scenographic approach. But really, I think what Frampton was getting at was the idea that architecture, shelter in general, had been reduced to a commodity, right? Just something that could be bought and sold without the kind of deep spiritual meaning that we often associate with it. Yes, that's amortizable. You can make good money off of it. But commodity culture is kind of rapacious. It takes over resources. It takes over land. And the so-called optimization ends up leading to sprawling settlements that need to keep growing to earn people profits. And Frampton saw what he called the autonomous realm of technoscience, basically the growth of technology as its own end, as being both important and also really, really worrying. I think that within that kind of concern about architecture being reduced to scenography on the one hand, to a commodity on the other, we can go back to these four questions. Is it good? Is it true? Is it beautiful? Is it right? And analyze, in the same way that people analyze the Crystal Palace, we can analyze a lot of the production in recent years, and we can look for examples of this sort of resistance where architects, designers, builders, even engineers have tried to find ways to resist that urge toward scenography or commodity. So let's look at 4 examples of this. Morality is maybe not quite as fashionable as it once was to talk about. It has these religious connotations, of course, but I think there are still critics and designers out there who worry about the kind of effects on our soul or on our spiritual being from too much technology. Leon Krier is maybe the self-proclaimed, or was the self-proclaimed heir to Ruskin. Krier looked at what a lot of the kind of commodity architecture, American suburbs in particular, had done to the environment, and he referred to this as environmental mismanagement. Building cities and landscapes that were not sustainable, that had no possible future, that were over-exploiting the resources that we have. Note the terminology he used this, though. How can we know right from wrong when we settle in wrong patterns? So this is really the moralist argument that goes back to Ruskin and to Pugin, that if we build incorrectly, that it has this kind of effect on our souls, right? What's bad for the environment, what's bad architecture is going to make us into kind of bad people. Krier's polemic was put very much in Ruskin and Pugin's terms. So here, Krier's drawings critiquing both the towerless sprawl, the endless kind of American suburb, and the kind of sprawling towers, right? Futureless verticality, he calls it. You can think of maybe one as an American suburb, the other maybe as Dubai or another kind of overgrown city. And he says in the middle, you might recognize the skyline there as being very similar to Pugin's ideal city, right? With steeples in Pugin's case, in Krier's case, these are some modestly scaled commercial skyscrapers. On the left, note that he's making an argument that says there's room for both public space and for economic space, right? There is room for commodity architecture, but it has to be tempered by these monuments that remind us of our kind of civic duties to one another. And he's also making an argument about the pace. In the center, he's saying that he is for slow architecture that evolves piece by piece, that grows organically, and that doesn't have the sort of emphasis on speed that a lot of pure commodity architecture really does. This, I would argue, is not maybe the most popular argument academically, but it's an interesting kind of parallel to the moral critique that we looked at with Pugin and Ruskin, where the industrialization, the optimization was bad because it was bad for us spiritually. Others have looked at others of these 4 kind of pillars. The idea of architectural ontology, that there is kind of truth or there is meaning within the actual materiality or the actual sensory experience of architecture, has been a very big one. And this has been maybe the most obvious kind of retreat or resistance to the idea of commodity architecture. The Finnish architect and writer Juhani Pallasmaa has maybe the most understandable or most easily comprehensible version of this. Architectural meaning, he says, comes from really deeply ingrained archaic responses and reactions, right? That we have this memory over time as a species, and that there are things in the way that we sense real materials or real space, real light, that have been completely obliterated by the speed of modern life and by the reduction of our buildings to basically visual sensations. Comfort, protection, and home, he says, are primordial. And the more that our architecture or our buildings show us that, the more we kind of stop, right, and are able to resist this flow of capital, but also this flow of really speedy time. There are examples of this that Pallasmaa and others point to, in particular the work of Carlo Scarpa, the Castelvecchio, this museum in Verona that was certainly a slow building in the sense that it took more than 15 years to construct. And it was really built by Scarpa piece by piece, or designed piece by piece, so that the whole museum, which is built into this old castle, on the riverfront in the center city of Verona is just filled with incidents of all sorts of sensory experience. Some of them are visual. The light that you see on the right is a bare bulb that is positioned to cast its glow over this very rough plastered wall. But some of them are also sensory. You can see the wooden handrails that are on kind of chains hanging, so that if you bump into them, you hear the handrail moving back and forth. Or the steps on the left that are actually tuned so that as you walk down them, you hear a descending scale. Scarpa's idea, I think, about a completely sensory architecture, one that engages touch and smell. Pallasmaa says even taste. Pallasmaa says that when he walks through Verona, he wants to, actually sit down and lick the paving stones of the city. That's maybe a little extreme, but you see this today in well-known buildings like the Vals Baths by Peter Zumthor, done in 1997. Here are a series of pools that in some cases are tuned temperature-wise. So some pools are hot, some pools are cold, but also some have a special kind of herbal essence that's blown into them so that we get a certain smell. The baths are built of this very local stone that is just a little bit rough to the touch. And Zumthor's point is that the building is really immersive, and that when we step into these baths, our senses are so kind of fulfilled that we basically come out of commodity time or commodity space, and we have a genuine, authentic sensory experience. We can also look at aesthetics, and I want to argue that some of what we call high-tech architecture is really trying to find meaning in a kind of aesthetic presentation of technology. The engineer and a University of Pennsylvania professor, Peter McCleary, had a great line where he's talking about the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who describes a blind man trying to understand the world by tapping his cane. And the cane gives him feedback about how the world works and what's going on. Is the ground soft? Is it hard? Is it wet? Etc. And that cane is what kind of connects us with the physical world. He wants the cane to kind of disappear. He doesn't want to pay attention to the cane itself. He wants to pay attention to what the cane is telling him. If you transpose that to a hammer, he says a well-designed hammer is something that you work through, right? You don't really notice the hammer. The technology disappears, and what you experience is the work itself. And I would argue, and I think McCleary has sort of argued, that this is a formula for the structural expression that we see in a lot of high-tech architecture, where the structure, in this case, a train shed by Nicholas Grimshaw, is so kind of true to the static principles behind it that it almost kind of disappears. And what we see is not the building itself, but we get a connection to the very basic structural principle. In this case, the three-hinged arch. We've looked at examples of three-hinged arches before. Grimshaw and his engineers have tuned the pieces of the arch on this asymmetrical train platform to be so tightly connected with the performance that they're almost transparent, in McCleary's terms, that what we're seeing is the true kind of static behavior. And we're basically looking through the structure at those principles. The detailing in a lot of Grimshaw's work is very much like this as well. So a pin joint is not only designed to provide the kind of flexibility that a shed like this needs, it's designed to make it very clear to us what the structure is actually doing and how it's supported. And again, when we look at this, McCleary's notion is that we're not looking at a highly polished piece of stainless steel or a blue painted piece of steel. What we're looking at is that principle of a pin connection presented to us as clearly and with as little kind of visual friction as possible. And then finally, I think there are heirs to William Morris and the ethical ideal of design. Today, we're, of course, worried about the impact of our buildings on the workers who make them. That's a direct translation of Morris's concern for the workers in his design shop. when we see controversies about worker safety, for instance, in constructing soccer stadiums in the Middle East. This, I think, is a legacy of William Morris and this kind of ethical critique. William McDonough, the American architect and writer, has suggested that our ethical concerns today are much more about the resources that we're taking from future generations and how we are good stewards of what we have, how our buildings can conserve those resources and make sure that we're being fair to the generations that are to come later. This, for him, is a reaction to this idea of Corbusier's that the house is a machine for living in. He says the unethical problem with that is that we end up designing, he says, for the machine and not for people. And his example of this today is when we optimize a building, we're often talking about solar heating the building. And what he says is we should be focusing on the comfort of people inside and not thinking so much about the object, but thinking about the experience of the people not only using the building, but I would also argue building the building. We need, he says, living machines, not machines for living in. And from this essay, we get the idea of the living machine, right? The net zero building that works with the flows of energy and resources across the site. The Hannover principles, which McDonough helped put together and which are in the reading list for this week, are a set basically of ethical ideals that I would argue in the 30 years or so since they were first published, we've really largely come to accept as this sort of ethical mission of building, the ethical mission of architecture, that our buildings need to be healthy, not just for the generation that we're in today, but also for future generations, that our buildings need to be part of the kind of ecosystem of the natural world. The idea that the buildings are the kind of nexus of human society, but also of that ecoverse, and that they are one of the ways that we balance those two things, I think has come to seem very natural. In 1992, maybe not quite so much. And maybe the most interesting one of these, I think, the one that's really come to define a lot of what we do as a building species, is to go back to this idea of understanding and working with natural energy flows. We have, he says, this perpetual solar income. This sounds very much like Bucky Fuller. Our buildings should be able to constantly take advantage of that. And McDonough, I really put into practice a lot of these principles in buildings like the Oberlin College Lewis Center, which was really one of the first buildings to be called a living building. It worked not only with solar energy, but also with the kind of water cycle, the waste cycle, being able to take the waste from a building and using natural techniques to recycle that. The Lewis Center to this day, I think, is a really profound example of what happens when we're rigorous about the kind of ethical principles that McDonough suggests. We really are getting to the point where we have no choice as a species but to instantiate. And even though this building is now more than 20 years old and out of date in a lot of ways, I think the ideals that were behind it, both from McDonough's point of view as a designer, but maybe more importantly from Oberlin's as a client, are reflected very much in a lot of the work that we do today. And I think that's a good place to sort of back up and say, the whole point of stock-taking exercise is to look at the values that we profess and to compare those against the values that we actually put out into the world. We've talked a lot about buildings that are bigger, taller, faster, and looked at the most sort of advanced cutting-edge technology, in some cases it seemed like a sort of end in itself. And in one sense, you could end a class like this by saying, look what we've managed to achieve. We've gone from the pyramids and Stonehenge to the Burj Khalifa, right, the current tallest record holder. Or we've gone from those Mycenaean Lion's Gate with that stone that for one of the first times really looks like a structurally designed object. We now have bridges like Millau Viaduct in the south of France that go on for miles and miles, right, that span hundreds or even thousands of feet at a time. Those are obviously very impressive, very intriguing design objects that are worth our time and study, worth understanding, and I think worth a good deal of recognition and praise. I think today, though, we also look at engineering achievements not just as kind of quantitative, but as qualitative. Or to put it another way, we look at them not just in the absolute value of height or performance or span. We look at that height or performance or span divided by the resources that have gone into it. So yes, these are hugely impressive buildings. They have had billions of dollars in some cases thrown at them in terms of resources, and tens of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide thrown into the air to make the materials to build them. I would argue that today we find equally impressive projects like this. These are water towers designed by an Italian designer named Arturo Vittori for a desert community in Ethiopia. Vittori found that women in this village were walking several miles a day to get water for their families. And after doing some calculations, realized that you could take advantage of the dew that collects in the morning, relatively small amounts. And if you could find a way to harvest that dew, you could collect a substantial amount of water, reduce the amount of time and energy that people were taking to go fetch it. So using native grasses to form the structure and importing a little bit of polypropylene netting, what Vittori was able to do was to develop these water towers. The polypropylene netting maintains its kind of low temperature from overnight, just enough to condense water from the air in the mornings. That drips into these collecting basins down below. And for a material cost of just a few bucks a piece, and for a very, very low carbon cost, this is a completely replicable, completely recyclable structure that provides the daily water needs for a small family each. That to me is a maybe as impressive in some ways as a Burj Khalifa or as a viaduct. That today we are as interested in the resource consumption and the performance divided by the amount of stuff, and particularly the amount of carbon that's gone into a project. So I'll leave it there. I'll turn us back to the little radiolarian, which I think for the first time maybe in the course introduced us to this idea that it's not just doing the most, but it's doing the most with the least that we find most impressive. And that, I think, has been the one consistent theme throughout the class, that when we as a species have built, we have, of course, had big ambitions. We like to build tall. We like to build big spans. But we have been limited always in the palette of materials we have and in the resources that we can put into those. And all of the design work, all of the construction work that we've looked at has in some way asked this question. Not only how can we make the best object, the noun of building, the noun of construction, the noun of work, but what does it take to realize that? And those are the verbs of building, the verb of construction, the verb of work. Those, to me, are the fundamental questions that we face going forward for our next 1,000 or 3,000 years, right? How do we do the most with the least?